the majority of our life is lived in liminal space.
And there's this in-between space, this liminal space.
This liminality that reveals possibility.
I think we're in a liminal moment, but also in a place of transformation.
I have great affection for the church and a troubled relationship with it.
Just to be alive in time means that we're on the threshold of the future.
That can't be the gospel because God said to love our neighbors.
We don't know what the future looks like. We have to work it out together.
Before we get into John, we're going to start with one of my other passions, which is astronomy. I love astronomy. I taught high schoolers astronomy for 3 years, just kind of on the side in a little co-op that we put together for homeschoolers, and it was a lot of fun. I learned a lot of stuff. And one of the easiest constellations to find, I bet 99% of you could probably spot it in the sky. You know which one I'm talking about? Big Dipper. Like, that's, everybody knows the Big Dipper, right? Like, did you know it's a part of a larger constellation called Ursa Major? It's a bear with a raccoon tail. Well, there's a story behind that. I can't remember it right off the bat, but Ursa Major is this big bear with a tail, and the Big Dipper is actually the tail of the bear. The other stars are a little bit dimmer. They're harder to see, so we kind of just focus in on the Big Dipper. That's what we know it as. And it's in different places in the sky. And there's some dispute about where the Big Dipper got its name outside of Ursa Major, but the Big Dipper part of it. And one of the most compelling stories that I found actually comes from a African-American folk song. That was pretty cool. I found it this week, and it was quietly passed on among the enslaved people fleeing north to freedom on the Underground Railroad. So this may have come from there. It's a possibility. So I'll tell you the story. There's a song called Follow the Drinking Gourd that was taught to blacks that were escaping their enslavers because travel by daylight meant that you were probably going to get caught and captured. So they moved mostly at night, guided by the stars, following this whole Underground Railroad. There's a map of some of the Underground Railroad. It was a network of safe houses and hidden routes and courageous people that helped probably somewhere near 100,000 people escape slavery in the South and move up into the North. Now, the Big Dipper was their main compass, not because, it's the brightest thing in the sky or because it's steady in the sky where it is. It's not. It's because the two end stars on the Big Dipper always point to the North Star, Polaris. And the North Star is actually at the end of the Little Dipper, which is a lot dimmer and harder to find. But if you can spot the Big Dipper and you kind of follow it around and shoot up, you'll always be able to spot Polaris. Now, Polaris is kind of harder to see because it's not super bright, but the Big Dipper is like everyone in here can go outside and look up and you'll say, there's the Big Dipper. And so this is kind of, they put this geography encoded inside of a song. And the first verse of the song, Follow the Drinking Gourd, went like this. I'm not going to sing it to you because I won't put you through that. But it says this: when the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. The old man is waiting for to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. And so there's all these different verses and choruses put together about following the Big Dipper, which they called the drinking gourd, because that would be like a gourd that's been dried and hollowed out, and they would use that to drink. And so possibly this is where we get the name Big Dipper. Now, the old man referred to in the song, the old man's waiting to carry you to freedom, was actually a sailor named Peg-Leg Joe. I mean, with a name like Peg-Leg Joe, I don't think you can have any other profession, right? Like, you got to be a sailor at that point. But he would travel ahead of fleeing groups, and he would mark trees or other landmarks with a charcoal outline of a human foot for the left foot and a little peg dot for his peg leg. So you were to follow this old man and his trail that he's kind of leaving behind. And then he would take you through the banks of the Ohio River, and the whole song guides you along the river. All the verses are guiding you north and just ready to carry them. The second verse actually continued the map. The riverbank will make a mighty good road. The dead trees show you the way. Left foot, peg foot, traveling on, follow the drinking gourd. So the song moved people along the banks of these rivers up toward the Tennessee River and then up into Ohio. And the whole journey is kind of encoded in the lyrics of this song. It's like the map is the melody. And so a lot of slaves couldn't read, so they couldn't have a map and here's the instructions. So they would teach them the song about looking for the Big Dipper that points you to the North Star, and then following all these rivers and old Peg Leg Joe and all that, trying to get to freedom. And what does that have to do with the woman at the well? Well, think about it, waters, we have stars, we have a song, we have a sailor with one leg, and this whole road to freedom, all paved out in this song. And I really want you to hold that image as we enter John 4, because the story we encounter there is built from a lot of similar kind of materials. We meet a woman that is seeking liberation, and water becomes the symbol of that liberation. In much the same way as the drinking gourd and the rivers and the sailor was very symbolic of the desired freedom of those fleeing slavery. And so keep that image in your mind of the drinking gourd as we explore this, because I think that's going to give us a little bit of a roadmap. Now, by the time we reach chapter 4, Jesus has already made a whole bunch of people mad. We talked about it last week. Nicodemus comes to him at night and he was like, I got questions for you. And there's this big, long conversation. We talked about that last week. But what happened before that was he walked into the temple, which was the holiest site, and he did so on the holiest day, which was Passover, and he tipped over a bunch of change moneylenders and drove all the animals out, basically made a bunch of people a lot less financially rich and brought the entire economy, religion, culture, and everything to halt in the middle of its highest holy day. So he made a lot of enemies at that point. They send Nicodemus to kind of like question him, like, all right, what's up? What's going on here? You're a dangerous guy. And so he's kind of rattled the power structures of Jerusalem. And the religious authorities are kind of like keeping an eye on him. And so we come to this quietly radical statement in all the Gospels, maybe the most, and it says he had to go through Samaria. He had to go through Samaria. The actual, he really didn't. Here's a picture of a map of the day. Most Jewish travelers of the time, they took the Eastern Road, a route that nearly doubled their journey, turning a 3-day trip if you were just to go from southern Judea straight up into Galilee. That would be a 3-day walking journey, but they hated the Samaritans. The Jews hated the Samaritans, and so they didn't want to walk through Samaria, so they went all the way over to the Jordan Valley, Jordan River, and then went north, and then came all the way back over. And it doubled the time that they spent walking. So imagine a 7-day hike that could have been 3. And it's like, that's what they're going through. And it says that he had to go through Samaria, not because there was no other way around. There's something else going on here, but something holy is demanding that he goes through Samaria. It's almost the same language of the Son of Man must be lifted up, and that we saw in chapter 3. Or I must go to Jerusalem. He's saying now I must go through Samaria. In the same language of this redemption language that he's got going on, something's happening. Why did the Jews hate the Samaritans so much? Like, what's the animosity there? To understand that story, we got to rewind about 700 years, because there's an entire story going on here that we're kind of missing. It shaped all of the culture. Now, after the death of Solomon, the kingdom split in two. They had a civil war, and it divided up into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, Israel and Judah. And then in 722, this Assyrian empire comes down, and they absolutely conquer and decimate that northern section of the people of God. And they deported much of the population into Syria, and then they tried to resettle the land with their own kind of people and their own religion and all those. But those who remained there and tried to continue to hold to their roots of who they were as a people became known as the Guardians. In English, it's guardians. In their language, it would be the Samaritans. They understood themselves to be the ones who were the true keepers of the ancient faith that came all the way from Abraham. And the southern Judeans believed themselves to be the keepers of the ancient faith. That was through the line of David. And so it was like this big, huge, they believed that they were heretics. They believed they were heretics. Not a lot of things have changed in the world, obviously. 2 things. And people are on both sides of it, arguing at each other. That happens, right? But the theological flashpoint for this thing was geography. Samaritans said God had to be worshipped on Mount Gerizim as that true place of worship. And then the Jews said, no, it's in Jerusalem at our temple. And so they were divided in this geographical sense. Now, when the Greeks came down and they conquered Judea in the south hundreds of years later, the Samaritans kind of stepped aside, and they're like, we're not really Jewish anyways. You go ahead and do what you want, Greeks. And they decimated a lot of the city. They fought them. They won, but through some guerrilla warfare tactics, the Jews fought back and earned their freedom again after a couple long years of. And then all of a sudden, this guy named John Hyrcanus invaded Samaria. He was a Jew, and he was mad at the Samaritans for not helping them in their time of need. So he invaded Samaria, destroyed towns, leveled their temple on Mount Gerizim, and walked away. So you can see a little bit of animosity. They went to their holy temple on their holy mountain and destroyed it and said, there, take that. Well, in retaliation, somewhere around the time of Jesus, the birth of Jesus, this band of Samaritans broke into the Jerusalem temple in the middle of the night, and they scattered human bones all over the sanctuary, desecrating their most holy space in Judaism. And so you can see that there's centuries of grievance, centuries of prejudice, centuries of hatred. And this is the terrain that Jesus is going to enter into. That's the animosity between Jews and Samaritans that hated each other so much that Jews would rather double their journey and walk around than go through. And Jesus says, I got to go through Samaria. And so Jesus arrives at this well in the heat of the day and sits down, tired from his journey, and a woman comes to draw water. And this alone should tell us something, that in that culture, women came to the well in the morning when the day was cool. And coming at noon in the full blaze of sun means that she's not welcome at the morning gathering. So she's already an outcast within an outcast community. She's doubly exiled, doubly marginalized as a Samaritan from the Jewish world, but then exiled from her own village for reasons that we're soon going to explore here. And this is who Jesus waits for, who he chooses to meet. There's something worth sitting with in that. Jesus knows the terrain of the outcasts. As his followers, I think so should we. We should understand that. The journey through Samaria is the journey into the neighborhoods the respectable refuse to enter. The prisons, the hospitals, the group homes, the care facilities, funeral homes, low-income housing projects, basically all of the places that society puts people that we don't know what to do with them because of their mental state or their grieving or their... Samaria is every soul that has a hard time fitting into the expectations of a society that has pushed them to the margins. Economically, racially, religiously, sexually, mentally, emotionally, physically. All of us as God's followers are walking through Samaria. The only question is whether or not we stop. Then this encounter begins with Jesus asking the woman for a drink of water, which was absolutely scandalous on multiple levels. Jewish men just did not speak publicly with women very often. It was just scandalous to do so, unless they were family or something like that. And then Jewish people didn't share vessels with Samaritans in a lot of the same way that segregation in the American South prohibited whites and blacks from drinking out of the same drinking fountains. So we have the same kind of hatred and animosity there. And one act of thirst, Jesus asking this woman for a drink of water, upends two categories of social law. And here he is. I'd like a drink of water. And the conversation moves quickly through all this really interesting stuff of living water and you won't thirst anymore. And we don't have a whole lot of time to dive into that stuff. That's interesting. But the really interesting thing is when Jesus says, go call your husband and come back. I thought Jesus was being all like cool here for a minute. And he's like, go get your husband. But he's doing something interesting. She says that I don't have a husband. Jesus is like, you're right. When you say you have no husband, the fact is you've already had 5. And the man you're with now is not your husband. Oh. Okay, so for my entire existence, I would read this as a woman searching for love in all the wrong places, burning through 5 relationships. He's on her 6th one. And really what she just needs is Jesus. Like that's how I've heard this passage interpreted over and over and over again in this patriarchal sexual purity culture that I grew up in. It has nothing to do with that, actually. There's none of that in here at all. And it's interesting that women always seem to carry the brunt of society's sexual taboos. The man's safe in the house, and here the woman is bearing the brunt of it all. But traditions would say that this woman is a sinner because she's promiscuous. The woman is, she's a cautionary tale about looking for love in the wrong place. But that doesn't hold up in the context and culture of the day. I'd like to paint a different world. for you to see, because that's looking at it through our culture eyes. We rewind back into this day. In the ancient world, marriages were arranged by families. Like, there wasn't a dating scene. You didn't go out to the club or the bar or whatever to meet some folks. Like, your dad would arrange your marriage for you. And it would be like, no, this is who you're marrying one day. You'd know that in advance. Everyone seemed to be cool with it. But they were arranged. There was no dating, no courtship romantically, no agency in that modern sense, no online dating apps or anything like that. Right? This woman has been married 5 times, was not necessarily a woman who burned through 5 relationships. My theory is that she was caught and trapped in an ancient legal institution called levirate marriage. Let me explain to you what levirate marriage is. In Matthew 22, it's kind of seen. Some Sadducees come up to Jesus, what they think is like this clever theological puzzle. And they describe this scenario. It's like, all right, if a man dies childless, his brother is supposed to marry the widow to raise up children for his brother. That's levirate marriage right there. In a society where women were not allowed to own land and it was an agricultural society, that meant if you were a widow with no child, you were immediately impoverished because you had no way of earning your keep. You're not allowed to sell in the marketplaces. You can't own land. So you're going to be in poverty, even if you're a young widow at the age of 20-something. And so what they did as an act, like almost a social security, a safety net, was they had something called levirate marriage. And it sounds really weird to us because we would never want to engage in this because we're 1,000, 2,000 years removed from this. But what would happen was the brother of the husband who died would have to marry this woman and then give her children, but not in his own name, but in his dead brother's name, as an act of social security, so that she wouldn't be impoverished. And that was kind of it. And so the Sadducees kind of paint this picture. Now, there were 7 brothers, and the first is married and has died childless, leaving the widow to his brother, and then the second, and then the third, and then the fourth, and then the fifth, and so on and so on. And they're like, well, all right, so who's she married to in when the resurrection happens? And Jesus has some interesting things to say about that. But all 7 brothers, all of a sudden, like, they weren't able to provide a child in their brother's name. That's levirate marriage. It was real, and it was designated as a form of social security in a world where women had no economic independence. So that's how we read this story now. If we reread this story with that levirate marriage in mind, husband 1 dies before giving her a son, and she is now widowed and in danger of poverty. So her first husband's brother takes her in, but still no son. He dies. Then the 3rd brother, then the 4th, then the 5th, just like the parable in Matthew 22. All of them are dead and unable to give her a child, and she still has no son. And in her culture, childlessness was not understood as a medical condition called infertility. It was read as a curse of God. You must be doing something wrong. So to remain childless despite following every single rule laid out for you, every law, every morality that you're supposed to follow, was to be marked as someone that God is turned away from. And so she's exiled here. Her town exiles her, not because she's been immoral and seems to be searching for love in all the wrong places, but because she has followed every single rule to the T and still has nothing to show for it. She's done everything God commanded, and God has not acted. And now she's confused. So this is not a cautionary tale about any kind of romantic stuff that could go on. She's a woman asking the oldest theological question there is: where is God when the system has failed you? That's what she's asking. So she steps outside of the law. She thinks, I'm going to have to take my situation into my own hands and find my own redemption because God is not listening to me. And so the man she's with now is not her husband. Now, this is actually in one of these old passages out of Genesis 22. There's a kind of desperation is seen in Scripture before. There's a woman named Tamar. Her husband dies before giving her a son. The levirate marriage obligation then falls to her brother-in-law. But the father is like, if I let my brother-in-law marry this woman, my daughter-in-law, then he might die too. So I'm not going to let that happen. And so left with nothing, Tamar disguises herself as a cult prostitute on the road, seduces Judah, the father, and then bears a child. through him. Sounds as a totally awkward story in our modern day thing. It's just like, what is even going on here? But this woman here says when Judah realized what had happened and who was responsible for the baby, he declared Tamar as more righteous than he was because he had withheld what was owed to her. And Tamar is actually listed in the genealogy of Jesus. That's how cool she is. So the woman at the well is like Tamar's spiritual sister. She's not failed to follow the rules. She has followed them all the way to their limits and found them insufficient. And so she takes matters into her own hands in an act, what looks like defiance, but is actually a form of courageous faith. So we tend to think of faith as like polite rule keeping that maintains the social status quo. But in scripture, faith looks like this determination to fight to make life better, the non-conforming spirit that stays true to your inner soul when the systems around you have failed you, the courage to act in a way that is true to yourself, even when your community has turned its back on you. Jesus sees all of this courage in her. He doesn't see a sinner. He sees someone who's absolutely outstanding. And the woman, realizing she's in a conversation with a prophet, does something that many commentators might say is she's deflected into like political and theological debates. Our ancestors worship on this mountain, but you Jews have to worship on that place over there. Is she changing the subject? Is she trying to divert from this uncomfortable thing that she's got going on? I don't think she is. I think she's staying on topic. Think about it this way. She's in the conversation. She's speaking to somebody who knows everything about her, and he knows the full weight of her history, the husbands, the exclusion, the desperation, the choices that she's made, and he has not condemned her. So he asks the real question underneath all the others. If my body's inability to bear children is read as God's curse, and if I am barred from the Jerusalem temple as a Samaritan, how do I make things right? If I have no avenue, if I am excluded and exiled from the community that might intercede for me, I can't even worship in the correct place. Is this just my life? Is there no way to resolve this? This is not a debate question. This is a cry of desperation. And instead of entertaining the old arguments between mountains, Jesus says something that would have sounded absolutely revolutionary in a world organized around brick and mortar temples and priests and geographic holy sites. He says, believe me, woman, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. A time is coming and has now come when you will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. And spirit and truth can be found here at the well at noon with you, the most marginalized person in the most marginalized community in the most marginalized moment of the day. He's saying this moment here, you think you're the most unholy person alive, and yet we are experiencing God in spirit in this moment here. We don't have to travel all the way to Jerusalem into a temple to do it. No single people has a monopoly on where and when God can be worshipped. And the holy is not contained by geography, is what he's saying. And she understands something significant is happening in this moment. And she says, I know that the Messiah is coming, and when he comes, he's going to explain everything. And then I'll have it all figured out, and I can get all things set straight. And Jesus says something absolutely staggering. He says, that's me. But he says it in a way that is really shocking. He says, I am the one speaking to you. Now, if we look into their thing, I am is the divine name spoken to Moses from the burning bush. Moses says, I need to know what your name is so that when I go back to the people, I can tell them who sent me. And he says, tell them the I am has sent you. That's the name that carries the entire history of liberation. The announcement that God, who made a covenant with Abraham, was now at work to set all of these captives free from their slavery in Egypt. And Jesus speaks his name to her, not to the disciples, not to the Pharisees, not to Nicodemus, the educated, the religious leaders that came to him in the secret of the night, nothing like that. He speaks it to this woman at a well at noon in Samaria, the most marginalized place you can get. Moses was in exile for 40 years in the wilderness, uncertain of his ability to speak, uncertain that anyone's going to even listen to him. And he heard these words and was commissioned to go back and lead his people out of slavery. And now the same words are spoken to this righteous, courageous, desperate woman. The commission is identical. Go lead an exodus. Now she runs back to the town and that has already rejected her, and she proclaims, come and see the guy who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah? come and see is a fun phrase in the Gospel of John. Jesus says it to his disciples when he calls them. And then the disciple says it to another disciple when he's called to follow Jesus. And now this Samaritan woman says the same phrase. She has no son, yet she is going to become the spiritual mother of the entire community of the town. The Eastern Orthodox Church honors this woman with a name, actually. They call her Fotini, which is the Greek word for light. And they call her equal to the apostles. The Western sensibilities, this can feel like a participation trophy, right? Like, we like the rom-com movies where everything is like tidy, restored endings. We want her to get a husband and live happily ever after and get a child and all that kind of stuff. But that's not what the story gives us. The story sinks it further into humanity than just a fun little rom-com movie, right? Jesus doesn't fix her situation. He transforms her context. He makes her the first bearer of the messianic secret. That's crazy right there. He commissions her to go to her people. And the people who have excluded her now listen to her, welcome her, care for her, and are transformed by what she carries. And then all of a sudden, this community around the Messiah gathers. Salvation here doesn't look like a private transaction between God and an individual soul. It looks like the discovery of a source that is deeper than the forces trying to destroy you. Good Lord, that's the liberation that is described in the word salvation that has become so spiritualized and religiousized that we just put it as a little private transaction between God and my soul. Now I'm good to go. There might be a little bit of that in that definition, but it's so much bigger than that. It's the more modern word should be liberation. Fotini is liberated, not from her circumstances, but from the exile that kept her from belonging anywhere. And so here, Jesus gives her authority and opportunity, and that was something that she had very little of before this encounter. We often look at God to ease our situations and fix our problems, and we pray for the outcomes that we can envision. We're like, please do this, like this. I got it all in my head. I got it all figured out. But God so often does something different, provides us with opportunity, provides us with authority instead of answers and fixed problems. When we're given opportunity, we build character, we discover our limitations and we surpass them, and we, expand our capacities of what we can do. We develop confidence, and confidence built honestly through genuine challenge gives us an authority that doesn't need to be loud or violent or aggressive or flagrant. It's that quiet authority of someone who knows what they have survived and what they have been trusted with. Now, that Underground Railroad that we started with, they had many guides, individuals and safe houses, networks of abolitionist families, but the stars were always there, fixed, reliable, pointing to that North Star. You could always find the Drinking Gourd. Polaris is not the brightest star in the sky by far. You might miss it if you don't know what you're looking for. You have to look first for the Drinking Gourd and follow that line at its far edge up into the dark for that faint little star that points north. I think sometimes that's what we as the people of God are supposed to be doing. We're not the North Star itself. We're just the constellation that helps people find it. The woman at the well became exactly that. She wasn't the Messiah. She wasn't sure of everything. She ran back full of questions. And this stunning encounter, she left her jar, forgot it at the well, but she pointed to something true. And people followed the line of her pointing all the way to the source. She said, come and see. Follow the Drinking Gourd. So in our lives, Jesus is not going to just fix all your problems and give you all the answers. But God can provide us with opportunity and authority to do something with it. And it is our job to then cultivate that into the answer to our own prayers.